Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Bakhmut, where there is some positional fighting here in the direction of Ivanivska, and to the north of that location, we see that the Russians are advancing towards the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the west of the forest patch. And with this, we see that there's continuous offensive operations by the Russians on the flanks of Ivanivska towards Chasiv Yar, with no significant progress, but there is heavy fortifications in the area, which makes sense. So with this, we see that there's continuous fighting in the Ivanivska direction and surrounding areas with no significant progress. We move on to the next section of the front line, which is the Avdiivka direction, where there is a serious number of Ukrainian counterattacks in the direction of Tonenka, Orelivka, and Berdychi. Additional Ukrainian reinforcements arrived to the front, allowing them to launch counterattacks to try and recapture lost positions. The Russians haven't properly consolidated these positions yet, so it's very heavy fighting taking place. Russian additional reinforcements arrived to this section of the front line as well, which means that right now we are seeing the Russians and Ukrainians facing off in these villages, as the Russians try to advance further to capture these villages, and the Ukrainians are trying to recapture and regain these lost positions. The most important target for the Ukrainians is Berdychi. As we see with the heights in the northern parts, the Ukrainians would be able to properly defend the next line of defense going through Semenivka and to Umanske, and with all of these fortifications in the area, while the Russians would have a hard time attacking the heights when facing off against these Ukrainian fortifications. While if they go through Berdychi, they could get an upper hand going through a leveled area and at the side or weak points of these fortifications, which would allow them a significant advantage compared to straight up ahead fighting against Ukrainian positions in the high ground. The Ukrainian forces here are definitely not lacking in any sort of artillery shells or other vehicles. As we see with the reinforcements arriving, we have the 61st Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces arriving to fight here by Orelivka, and with the 47th Mechanized Brigade fighting a defensive battle in Berdychi. They're trying to grind down the Russian forces before launching counterattacks. In this regard, there is this video that was released by the Ukrainians of the 47th Mechanized Brigade in the direction of Berdychi, where they ambushed a Russian landing within the village. Now, I couldn't show the video here on YouTube due to the issues with monetization, and as such, I will explain the sequence of events with still frame photos. So starting out, the BTR of the Russian forces, in addition to the squad-sized units of about 12 soldiers on top of it, are driving to Berdychi under fire of Ukrainian artillery, but this fire is very sporadic, it's not very accurate, and it doesn't really hit the vehicle. As soon as the Russian soldiers disembark, they take cover in the forest areas and in the positions down here. The BTR itself, you have to notice, is a vehicle that is not really capable of fighting. If it fights off against this Bradley that is standing there in ambush, it would definitely lose and not contribute to anything. The Russian soldiers are trying to take cover as they're instantly under fire by this Bradley, and while they're being suppressed by the fire of the Bradley, Ukrainian artillery hits their positions as well as cluster munitions, so they get heavily bombarded by this while under suppressive fire, which prevents them from running away and taking cover. All of these soldiers taking cover in the forest line likely do not get out of there alive, and the BTR was hit as well on the way back. However, it is very likely that the soldiers did survive, as we see the videos being cut from the point at which the vehicle drives to the side, and then there is a time skip between it being destroyed and it being abandoned. The fighting itself we see is a very well coordinated ambush by the Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line, and this is why the Russians are having such a hard time advancing, because these elite units, and I know someone always complains in the chat, what do you mean elite units? Well, this is clearly what elite units are compared to these Russian soldiers we see based on their uniforms are likely recently mobilized, recently come to the front. This is one of their first missions, and this is why we're seeing that they fell into this ambush. They couldn't have prepared well for it, and at the same time the Ukrainian forces are simply some of their best available forces, which makes it very difficult for them to have any chance at succeeding in this situation. So based on this footage, we can see that the Russians are having a lot of trouble capturing Berdychi as well as these villages, and it's a lot of fighting that takes place to capture these villages. However, the most interesting part about this village is the lack of artillery coverage by the Russians against the Ukrainian positions, as well as the lack of additional vehicles to support this landing by the Russians. It is a similar case scenario as the one in Sinkivka. Whoever commanded this assault and whoever provided the orders for this assault is likely more incompetent than the one in Sinkivka, because at the very least the one in Sinkivka added multiple layers of soldiers, there a lot of vehicles and etc., while there were some tanks and armored vehicles available. In contrary, the Russians here only had one single BTR with one single squad going there to then instantly be ambushed with no fire support at all. No artillery support, no air force support, and no tank armored vehicle support. The only armored vehicle available is a BTR, which can't really fight. Its job is to go in, put off the soldiers, and then withdraw. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novomykhailivka, the Russians had made an advancement here towards the center of the town. And with this advancement, we see them getting closer and closer to the center. The Russian forces here are trying to gain control over the northern parts as well as the central parts to try and get a proper foothold, allowing them to have a secure supply in and out of the town. Right now, the proximity of their supply routes to the Ukrainian positions is very close, which means that the fire support of the Russians and the Ukrainians in the section of the front line, if there's enough artillery on both sides, is fairly equal. Well, this raises the question as to the Ukrainians are reported to have a lack of ammunition and the Russians have plenty of ammunition, outfiring the Ukrainians by a ratio of 6-1 or 7-1. Meanwhile, we saw with the ambush that there was no fire support for the Russians. This, of course, points towards a command issue. Now, it was also raised as a point by Russian commentators that the commander in charge of the Avdiivka area, likely one of the commanders, not the commander of the whole operation, is not really that competent. This was reported by multiple sources, including a Russian journalist. But based on this, we see that the Russian forces throughout this operation, throughout this war, really has this same issue. As I mentioned in my previous video yesterday talking about human wave tactics, the Russians have a corruption problem in their army, and this corruption problem is the one that causes these cases. The Russians may not have known that the Ukrainians would ambush them in Berdychi, but they did know that they were sending a BTR of soldiers, which means that they do not have any fire support. This means that they should have drones flying overhead the BTR, trying to see if there is any ambush and then provide fire support instantly. Instead, what we see is that the Ukrainians are providing fire support instantly as they were prepared and saw the BTR coming from miles away. This creates the scenario in which the Russians are taking a lot of casualties in this specific battle itself alone. The Russians took more casualties than the Ukrainians, with the Ukrainians taking no losses and the Russians losing an entire squad and a BTR. However, there is no indication that this is a common occurrence, considering the fact that with this happening, the Ukrainians recorded everything and posted it instantly, while we have hardly seen a lot of these videos. We've seen them at least once every 1 to 2 or even 3 months. The last one we saw similar to this was in Sinkivka, which was over 3 months ago, 3.5 months ago. So it is definitely not something that is a common occurrence. However, when it does happen, we see that the Russians sometimes launch these stupid assaults, which costs life and material, and in the end, they don't really achieve anything, while the Ukrainians are getting this PR propaganda victory. Look at how overpowered our forces are. We got this easy. The Russians are taking heavy casualties because the elite Ukrainian forces, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade, is capable of dealing with a lot of these Russian forces that are not on the elite level, while the average Russian soldier is combined together in the sense that both the Bakhmut forces, the Chechen forces, the Wagner forces, and everyone are combined in the same units. This means that on the contrary to the Ukrainians, the Russians do not have any elite units. They have average units, and these average units includes squads with little to no training and squads with a lot of training and a lot of experience. Therefore, we see that whenever the Ukrainian elite units face off against Russian weaker units, they will have a much greater advantage, especially in material and in coordination, equipment, fire support, etc., than the Russians have available, especially if the Russian commander is also an idiot. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.